So hello, my name is David McDonald, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar on designing online courses. I'm joined today by my colleague Jean-Pascal, who's going to be on the keyboard and helping me out in the chat. So you might hear his voice occasionally also. He'll help direct me towards questions that would do better with a live response. And I'll also just keep track of all the questions that are happening in the chat, answer them when possible, and then let me know when I can answer them. Jean-Pascal and I are both educational specialists here at the Teaching and Learning Support Service, and we both have experience working on developing face-to-face, blended, and online courses. So we'll try to bring some of those experiences in when we're responding to questions, and we're happy to talk about those experiences as well if you have particular questions about that. So if you do have questions moving forward or you need clarification about anything, please write them first in the chat, and we'll answer as many questions as possible and leave plenty of time at the end to answer any outstanding questions about the content of the webinar or other things that are on your mind related to developing online courses. A quick note on the platform before getting started. There's a files box in the bottom left corner, and this is where you can download all the materials for today's webinar. So you should see a whole list of files. If you click on them, it'll allow you to then download it. And there's also a zip file in there with all the handouts and the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so to situate us in this context, this is actually the first webinar in a series of 3 where we plan on showing you some of the tools and resources to help you develop a good online course. And today's theme is really about creating a foundation or mapping your existing material, or put in another way, taking inventory of what you have right now. So my assumption is that most of you are in a situation where you have content ready for a face-to-face class, but you're needing to convert that online. If you're in a different situation, you don't have content ready for an online class and you're really starting from scratch, no need to worry. The tools and strategies that I'm showing you today are still going to be relevant, but the examples that I'm mentioning might speak more towards people who are transitioning from a face-to-face to an online course. So again, really in webinar 1 right now, we're laying the groundwork and then developing it further in webinars 2, where we're going to talk about ways to communicate and to design elements for the online space. And then in webinars 3, talking about how to build those things, whether it's in virtual campus, meaning Brightspace, or whether it's about developing podcasts or videos or other content that you would need to create. So I know maybe in this series, the mapping portion is a little less sexy, but I think it's probably one of the more important steps in the design process. By building these pieces right, we can ensure that we're building the right things for our course and for our learners. So a couple little learning outcomes for today. We're going to highlight the differences between face-to-face and online courses, summarize the course design process, and then explore tools and resources to help you map your structure. And over the next 45 or 60 minutes, we'll do a few different things, look at the differences between online and face-to-face, look at the course design process, dive into a tool to help you map your course, and this will be the bulk of the workshop, and then look at some resources and examples for online courses. And then, like I said before, I'll give us plenty of time for questions and to answer anything that you have on your mind related to online teaching. Now that I've introduced myself and Jean-Pascal, I just want to start with a quick little icebreaker to get to know who's in this webinar with us today. So you should see a little poll appearing on your screen, and then I'll open it up here. And the question is just, have you ever created an online course before? At the same time, I'll broadcast the results for you so you can see the experience of your colleagues in this webinar. It seems most people have answered. We have about 70% of the people who have never developed an online course, 10% yes, and a couple, 20% or so have done sort of a blend of either blended, hybrid, or flipped learning. So maybe some experience with the online format, but not fully developing an online course. And then related to this question, I was just curious also of people's experience with virtual campus. So this is the main platform right now that we're using to develop online courses. So what's your general comfort level with virtual campus or Brightspace? Do you feel like you've mastered it? Are you comfortable with it? Are you still learning the features, or do you have no idea what you're doing? Which, again, that's fine too. We're all learning here. And again, I'll just broadcast these results. The majority of the people seem to have answered. I like that everybody's on the ball this morning. Everybody's answering quickly. And it seems the most people are still learning the feature, so likely you were forced to get to know it in the last couple of weeks of the previous semester. But a lot of you also, about 40%, have used some of the more advanced features like checklists, exams, and assignments. So you feel comfortable with those features as well, which is great to know also. And I can definitely talk about some of those Brightspace components as we move forward and talk about different activities and things like that. So there's a lot of reasons you might be joining us today, whether it's to get strategies and tools for developing an online course. Maybe you were missing your colleagues and just wanted some virtual contact with them through this chat. Or maybe you're just curious or excited about the potential of online learning and you want to join us today to gain some more knowledge about that. Regardless of the reason why you're joining us, I just wanted to make sure that you know upfront that we're here to help, and we're here to help beyond this webinar. So once this is over, our team is still around to support you. We don't disappear, so don't hesitate to reach out to us, and I'll provide the email at the end of the webinar so that you can contact us and keep the conversation going. So you may have heard a few terms thrown around recently related to online teaching, in particular the terms distance versus online and synchronous versus asynchronous. So I wanted to start us off by looking at the differences between these terms and what they mean. The first of these, distance versus online education, for our purposes here today, there really isn't a practical difference. So we can consider them as synonyms. Whereas in the literature, sometimes we'll see distance education as being more of an umbrella term and online learning fitting within that. For the purposes of these webinars, I'll favor the term online teaching and learning. And when I say online teaching and learning, I just mean teaching that's delivered completely online using the internet. So teachers and instructors aren't required to be in the same physical location at the same time. Related to that, synchronous versus asynchronous. This is really just different ways that we can deliver content. So in this case, synchronous meaning done in real time and asynchronous done at different times. So it can happen synchronously in real time through activities like live chats or web conferences like we're doing right now, among other tools and platforms, or it can happen asynchronously at different times through activities like discussion forums or pre-recorded videos or other forms of multimedia. Essentially, with asynchronous uh, teaching or asynchronous methods, the students are completing the work according to their own schedule. So this type of work they're not required to be virtually present at a set time or date. They can complete them in a more flexible way. And when we teach online, we're going to want to use both of these formats to our advantage. So we're not limited to only using one. If you're developing an online course, you don't have to decide between developing an online synchronous course or an online asynchronous course. You can do both within your teaching. As an example of what that might look like, and we'll talk a bit more about this later on, but you could start off a course or a class rather with a 30-minute synchronous lecture with your students where you're setting the stage for a particular topic or the work that needs to be completed for that week. And then students could go off and complete asynchronous activities like readings or videos, discussions, or even assignments or interactive activities that they might need to complete online. And then when we think of online versus in-class learning, I think happily there's a lot of similarities between the two formats. The basic principles or theories that guide good teaching for face-to-face versus online are very similar. So we're not developing a whole new set of teaching skills when we go online. What tends to change, of course, is the methods and the technology that we're using, but the things that we as learners or we as instructors appreciate don't change much. So things like your enthusiasm for the subject, it's still going to be relevant in an online course. Um, that you're communicating your expectations to students for assignments and for activities is still going to be relevant. That you're using activities and that you're providing feedback to students about those assignments, again, is going to be relevant. And as a last point, this idea of building a sense of community as being one of the great things about in-class learning, likewise, is one of the great things about online learning. So very similar best practices, if you will, for both online and in-class teaching. So we're not starting from scratch here. What really changes, like I mentioned before, is the methods. So we don't do those things in the same ways when we go online. And we want to take advantage of the format's strengths. So some of those benefits or opportunities that we might have when developing an online course can include things like the flexibility that it offers, not only for the students, but also for the instructor and in the way that we access content online. You're also providing a bit more opportunities for your students to do some self-directed learning. And there's different ways for students to interact with not only the content, but students and also with you. The distance between you and the student now isn't a full lecture hall, it's just a screen, right? So using tools like live chat or webinars or discussion forums, it can feel a bit more personal, or at least the relationship feels a bit closer in those cases. And the fact that your students are kind of forced into the center of the experience is also one of the positive of online learning. And what I mean by that is the eyes of the screen are now facing the students, right? It's how they interact with the course. They can't just sit passively in a lecture hall and not do anything. When it's online, they actually have to do something with the material. And if not, you're going to notice it because they're not engaging with the content online. That being said, because there is a lot of content that we're putting online and maybe a bit more engagement in a written form or in a multimedia form, it's a bit harder for us to wing it. Not that any of you are doing this, but it is a bit harder to wing it online because you need content for students to complete. You can't do it the week before. You have to put some work into it so that it's ready to go and that all of the technical issues and bugs are worked out before students actually complete the work. So how can we do this? How can we create online interactions and courses in general? Here, I think it's useful to consider the course design process. And sort of an aside, usually this is a workshop that takes about 3 hours to complete. So I'm really giving you the bare bones here, the Coles Note version of the course design process. So if you did want to go into more depth about some of these concepts or principles, then by all means, please do contact us. But the course design process for our sake here today can be summarized or boiled down to 4 basic steps. So course description, where we define our course context, the objectives or themes of our course, a layout of our feedback and evaluation strategies, and our teaching and learning activities as well. So these are the 4 kind of basic steps when you create a course, but these are by no means linear. So you're ideally maybe doing these one after the other, but it's understood that you'd be going back and forth between them as you develop your course, that you change your mind, that you discover a new resource, or that you see something that would be more relevant. So your objectives, feedback, and teaching activities would change in consequence of the development across all of these categories. The one thing that we want to make sure, of course, when we're developing our course is that these elements are all aligned. So if when you develop your objectives, you want to make sure that your evaluations respond to those objectives. And you want to make sure, likewise, that your teaching and learning activities help students succeed on their evaluations. Another way to frame the course design process would be in answering these 4 questions. So we might look at it instead as course description being defining what is our context, the objectives or themes being where do we want to go or where do we want students to be able to go, the feedback and evaluation strategies, answering the questions, how will we know we've arrived or how will we know that students have achieved what we intended them to, and the teaching and learning activities being how will we get there or how will students get to where we want them to go. And these really are going to be the questions that are guiding us in the tool that I'm about to show you. So what we have here outlined in terms of a mapping strategy, again, you'll find it at the bottom window there in the download box of Adobe Connect. And this is just sort of an organizer for you to think about your course and to start taking inventory of the content that you've already created or putting in blocks for the content that you want to create. It was developed as a table. We've called it, you might have heard the term alignment table in the past. This is essentially that. However, this is by no means the only way to organize a course. So if you prefer doing it by a list or a concept map, then you can take the same major categories found in this document and organize them in a different way. Essentially, whatever works for you is fine, but I think the general categories is still going to be useful for you as you're developing and mapping your course. So what I'll do now is just open up the handout, and I'll go over some of the pages here and explain how you would go about completing them on your own afterwards. And I realize that the PowerPoint, depending on your, or rather the PDF, depending on your screen resolution, might be a little bit small. But again, knowing that you have the handout available to you to download, and not that big of a deal if you can't see all the tiny little details here. So in the first part of the document, we're really just asking you to reflect on your context to help you prepare how to best teach the material. So in this section here, we're thinking about things like the enrollment, how many students you're going to have, because that'll affect maybe some of the platforms that you use or the activities that you create for your online course. Just a basic description of your course so that you know what it is that you're teaching and the themes of your course, as well as where your course is situated within the program. So are there prerequisites, co-requisites, or even accreditation requirements that you need to consider and that you need to make sure that you're reaching in your course? If so, writing them down here inside of the document. Then thinking about both the experience of your students and your own experiences teaching the course. So for your students, we're asking you to think about the typical background of your students, the faculty, the programs, the year of study, and their typical goals for enrolling in the course. And again, the justification here and the rationale for doing so is that way you can better tailor the content and your course to respond to the needs of your learners. So as an example, in a biology course, a first-year biology course, if I know that the majority of my students are first year and most of them want to enter medical school, then maybe I'm tailoring some of my content to respond to some of those interests, and I'm making sure that the content is approachable for first-year novice learners, as opposed to maybe a fourth-year course where they would already have experience in biology with some of those base concepts. So we're just writing this down so that we have that reference point that we can refer back to as we're developing our content and making sure that we're responding to the needs of our learners and to the course in general. And then afterwards, you're part of this process as well, so it's important that you identify your own preferences for teaching, and that it can include things as simple as the technologies that you like to use, the materials that you like to use, or even activities that you find are effective within your particular context. And the last point here, any special challenges, that could be things like technology, which is probably one of the special challenges that the majority of us would identify for the coming semester. So my special challenge is going to be converting it to an online course, and that's completely understandable, but it could also be things related to the subject matter. So as an example, a special challenge for a psychology course might be that students entering my class often think that psychology is self-evident. So once they hear of a concept, they think that it's very obvious, and they ignore the methodology that goes behind confirming that particular concept or theory. So my special challenge would be to ensure that I communicate effectively that the methodology is important and that these concepts aren't necessarily self-evident. And then once you finish this first kind of reflection on your general course, these kind of foundational elements are going to help guide us in terms of what we develop later on, and to make sure that our content responds to either our learner or personal preferences or particular accreditation or special challenges that we might have identified. Then on the second page here, we're starting to map out our course. So again, whether you have an existing course that you're converting online or that you're developing a course from scratch, you're going through each of these columns here and identifying the pieces related to the large category. I started off in the first column by organizing it by weeks. So the majority of you will probably organize your course by weeks since that's how you teach it, but you might have other organization techniques for your content. So if you're, for example, organizing your course in terms of modules or themes, you could replace these numbers with the particular theme or module instead. Maybe a more concrete example of that, if I was teaching an education course on learning theories, maybe my 12 weeks would be divided into 4 major modules on constructivism, behaviorism, cognitivism, and another ism. And they would each take 4 weeks to complete. So the organizational structure might look a little bit different, but it would still cover the full 12 weeks. So again, based on your need, you can reorganize that particular column to suit that. And then afterwards, you're going to go towards defining your objectives or themes for that particular week or module. So some of you might already have formalized learning objectives in place for each of your weeks. But if you don't, what I would consider doing is looking at the material that you currently have. And so things like your PowerPoint presentations, the activities or the assessments that you've given to students, and trying to identify the goal that you had for that particular session. So what were you trying to achieve, or what were you trying to have students achieve in those classes? And then using that as your goal to help situate you moving forward and how you could translate that to the online environment. So as an example, was your goal to just present information? Was it to check for understanding? Did you want students to synthesize arguments from research? Was your goal in that particular class to have them collaborate or discuss, or to start talking like people in the discipline? Whatever the case may be, start outlining and mapping down the goals for each of those sessions or modules. And later those goals will help situate us in terms of what we want to do and how we can make it happen online, and whether we need to make modifications to them to be able to do them online. In the next column, you're going to start mapping out your feedback and evaluation strategies. So essentially, how are you currently assessing your students in your course, and how are you providing feedback about their progress? So are there any high-stake tests that you're currently doing, things like final exam, papers, midterms, and are there any opportunities for medium or low-stake assessments that you're currently doing? So things like participation marks for taking part in activities. Maybe you've used quizzes or pop quizzes in your course in the past, or really any other activities that students are getting sort of minor grades on. And again, you're mapping these out so that you can see if they can be produced online afterwards, or if they can be modified slightly to still meet your existing structure. You'll also want to start thinking about how you're providing feedback to your students right now, whether that's through peer evaluations, self-reflections. Maybe some of you who identified yourselves as having used a bit more functionalities in Virtual Campus are already using automated feedback. So things like quizzes online, or pushing out general messages to the students. Or maybe you're already using things like written feedback or video and audio feedback in an online environment. But again, just listing down what you're currently doing or maybe what you anticipate wanting to do. And then the next module, we're just listing down the activities that you and your students are completing across each class. So when you think about your lessons, what do you typically do? Do you typically just present a lecture? And if so, in what form? Are you lecturing presentation form? Are you writing things down and distributing handouts? Are you creating activities? What are all the things that you're doing for each of these sessions? And what are the things that your students need to do to be able to succeed across those different weeks? So are there readings that they need to do? Are there discussion topics that they need to contribute to? Activities, whatever the case may be. And this is likely the part that's going to need a little bit more tweaking or fine tuning when we go online. It won't be an exact conversion when we go from face-to-face to online, but I'll talk a bit more in the next slide how we can start thinking about converting our activities for the online format. And then the second to last column here, you're just listing essentially all the materials that you have for your course right now. So whether it's readings or handouts, your own presentations, maybe you're already making use of multimedia, so things like documentaries or movies, whatever the case may be, listing them here in this column so that you're aware of what you have available to you and what you can reuse in the online environment. And in the last column, we'll be asking you to make a decision about what you can reuse, what you would need to modify, find, or create. And I know that it's not the easiest thing to do when you don't have experience creating an online course. So how am I supposed to know what I can keep or what I need to modify if I've never developed it? And that's why on this last page here, we have a couple of reflection questions to help guide you about whether or not the particular content, activities, or evaluations that you've identified would be well suited for the online environment. So if you take a look at those reflection questions and then look back at the content that you've taken inventory of, this will help you make a decision, hopefully, about what might be well suited for an online environment and what might need some little tweaks or fine tuning and what needs to be fully redeveloped, or at least where you might have gaps that need to be responded to. And that very briefly is the handout and the strategy tool that we have on offer here today. So again, if you do have more questions, then feel free to pose those in the discussion forum. And maybe I'll just take a quick pause right now to see with Jean-Pascal if there are any questions about this particular handout before I move on to the next section.
David, so far there's no unanswered question, but I see someone typing, so maybe it's related. I'll let you know.
Perfect, thank you. And again, if they come to you a bit later, those questions, then feel free to type them in the chat, and we will have that 15-20 minutes at the end to answer any open questions. So now if I go back to the PowerPoint here, I had mentioned before thinking about how you would develop teaching and learning activities for the online environment. And here I find it's useful to consider the active learning process. So the active learning process is the same whether you're teaching face-to-face or online, but again, the methods would change a little bit. And active learning can be kind of thought of as these three basic steps. So these aren't again, linear. An activity might have all of these things included in one, but it's just a little bit easier sometimes to divide it into these 3 points to help us create proper activities or proper content for our course and to make it active for our learners. So those 3 points are providing a starting point, providing an experience, and providing an opportunity for feedback or reflection. So when I say providing a starting point, typically in a face-to-face class, that would mean presenting the topic. So we're giving a lecture about a topic or a concept to the students. Online, that could look a little bit different. So you might be doing a combination of elements. Maybe you're doing a pre-recorded video segment about a concept. Maybe you're doing a web conference like we're doing now. Maybe you're having them do readings or visiting websites, or looking at other sorts of multimedia like videos, documentaries, or even social media accounts related to your particular field, as an example. Next, providing an experience. Essentially here what we're trying to answer is, what will students do with that information? So in class, if you give a lecture, what are students going to do with that lecture? And likewise, online, if you give a video and a web conference and all this other multimedia, students that have absorbed all that information, now what are they going to do with it? And this is where we want to provide an experience. So typically in class, this might take the form of an activity like reflection on a case study or a discussion or maybe a problem set. And online, we can replicate that. We can still do our case studies and our problem sets, but we might also have them research a question and go online and do an inquiry-based activity. We can have them create something related to that particular concept. So maybe they need to create their own infographic explaining a theme. Maybe they need to create their own video explaining a theme, or perhaps they're contributing to a discussion online, whether through a discussion forum or again through a web conferencing platform like Teams or Adobe Connect. And this last step here kind of cements the whole active learning process. Here we're having students reflect on their actions and obtaining feedback on what they've done. So we do this because we want them to consider what they've done and why. So were they successful in what they did? And if they were successful, why? And if they weren't successful, why not? In class, this can maybe be an implicit component of an activity. So in a discussion, as an example, if I'm communicating with my colleagues and I say something that's wrong, usually I'll be corrected immediately in the moment. Online in a discussion forum, that might be delayed a little bit. However, we can still leverage peer feedback online just using different tools. And that feedback online as well as in class can take a lot of different formats. So we might be asking students to evaluate their peers. We might have them reflect on their own actions and what they think they did correctly or incorrectly. We might be providing them with automated feedback in the form of things that we've pre-written and distribute after they've completed a quiz, as an example. Or we can also distribute general comments based off the work we've seen to all students. So I could record a video, for example, with general guidelines about the things that I saw people mostly do well and things that I saw that people need to improve on, or gaps in their understanding. I could record an audio for each student based on their homework, and that would be maybe a little quicker than writing it out. Or I can revert to the classic writing feedback on a paper and distributing it back to the students. So yeah, all these different points just to communicate that what you would do in class to create an active learning process would be the same as online, but the process would be a little bit different. And just to summarize again here, when I say active learning, I just mean doing something and reflecting on what it is that you're doing. To help with that and to provide a bit more ideas, I mean, I mentioned a few here, but maybe a bit quickly. We do have an activity handout in the file section at the bottom called an online teaching index. And in there, we have a couple suggestions for types of activities that you could include in an online course. And towards the end of the webinar here, I'll provide links to other universities who have these online teaching indexes as well. Again, just to let you know what's maybe realistic to achieve online and what's relatively simple to do online for those of you who maybe don't have that experience with online education. If you get to the end of that worksheet that we just talked about and you make a decision that you need to find or create something new, this is where you're going to want to leverage existing resources. And that can come in quite a variety of different forms. Listed here, I mentioned colleagues. So when I say colleagues, I mean definitely the TLSS. So feel free to reach out to us and to communicate with us. We're happy to help you brainstorm and develop these activities and your course in general. but also the colleagues within your own faculty. So you all have your range of expertise, you all have your range of experiences with different teaching formats. Feel free to reach out to your colleagues and get their ideas and maybe collaborate on particular activities or content that you could both leverage within your courses. So as an example, doing a pre-recorded video for a guest lecturer for a particular unit within your class could be a great way to complement or supplement your online teaching. As well, taking advantage of colleagues that you might know from other universities. So there might be less of a competition there with other universities and your colleagues. And maybe if you're both teaching the same course, you could do things that would benefit both of you across the institutions. You'll also want to take advantage of your colleagues at Morset Library here at the University of Ottawa. And they have quite a bit of tools available to you, a lot of which will have their own webinars now. I believe they start next week. So there's a webinar on the ARIES Course Reserve Service, as well as open educational resources. But these are things that you can go and explore now yourself as well. So ARIES Course Reserve Service would allow you to book multimedia as well, things like documentaries, videos, readings, textbooks, etc., in a digital form and putting them within your course. And there's also a range of open educational resources that are available to you. So open educational resources are things that are made publicly available for people to reuse, remix, or to place within their course. There's varying degrees of flexibility in those open educational resources, but they're a good starting ground for content that might be useful for your course. And I'll provide other links to open educational resources in a second as well. And then leveraging video databases. So things like YouTube, Vimeo, or other hosting platforms that you might be aware of. Things like, as an example, TED Talk can be a useful way to introduce a topic or to create an engaging hook for your class, and then going into more details through other forms of media like readings, articles, social media accounts, or what have you. So yeah, taking the landscape of what exists currently so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and using that within your course and then supplementing it with your own content that you develop. Related to those additional resources, like I mentioned a few times, there's the mapping handout for you that's available, the online activities index, and I also, pardon me, also created the active learning process as a handout. So it explains the 3 steps that I described there, as well as some examples of what that might look like for a face-to-face or an online course. And then a couple useful links before we open it up to questions. The ARIES Course Reserve Service, open educational resources. We also have a media center at the library, so our media librarians can help you find media for your course. There's the Copyright Office at the University of Ottawa, so if you're not sure if the material that you're using is appropriate or not, or maybe you're taking too much, or you're not sure of the particular copyright restrictions or Creative Commons restrictions and what they mean, this is the website to go to. There's a lot of valuable resources for you in terms of what's feasible to do for a face-to-face class, as well as online and within virtual campus. And then there's, like I mentioned, a whole range of open educational resources available online. Oftentimes just typing in OER and then the thing that you're looking for will produce those results. But our university, as well as other universities, have taken the time to create an index of resources based off particular disciplines. So you can go to these websites here and find links to resources particular to your discipline. So as an example, if you're in business or biology, there's often banks of case studies available for you to download and reuse or remix for your particular course and context. Likewise, with the start of the pandemic, there was quite a few of crowdsourced guides that began being developed. These are all open Google documents that people contribute to. I think the content on there is great, and there's a lot of valuable resources, whether it's towards tools or general articles to help you get started. I would just take it with a grain of salt as well. It's not necessarily edited every day are verified. So just make sure that the information there speaks to your particular needs and context, and we can always help you verify that if necessary. And then a couple other things, a few articles from the Chronicle of Higher Education on getting started as an online teacher. A lot of these points I've summarized here, but it's done in a different format in article form. And then a couple more links towards online teaching activity indexes. And then just to wrap up before I share our contact information, like I mentioned earlier in the webinar, the next step would be the webinar on communicating. And what we mean here by communicating is starting to actually write the content for your online environment. With an online course, it means that you're writing a lot. So there's not only the instructions that you have to put, but you need to make sure that everything that you put online is self-evident for your students. So I think we often take for granted this component because in class, if I say something and people are confused, I tend to be able to see it in their faces and I can quickly or spontaneously respond to that confusion. Online, we don't necessarily have that luxury. So that means we need to write things out a bit more clearly, concisely, and we need to do that way in advance and not winging it like I mentioned before. So here we'll talk about how to write for the online environment and how to make it conducive for the online environment and for the people who are reading it, as well as a few design guidelines for things like videos and graphics or the general layout of your virtual campus and what that might look like and how you might achieve that. And then in the third webinar series, again, this is where we'll actually start building it and showing you how to build it, whether it's Adobe Connect webinar or a Teams webinar or things in Virtual Campus or Brightspace. Thought of otherwise, if we look at those three different webinar series, the first webinar in Virtual Campus would kind of look like this. Not much is being done in Virtual Campus. You're doing all your planning outside. The second webinar series would start actually maybe putting some text to paper and maybe putting it online to see what it looks like, but very kind of plain, not too much going on in terms of the look and feel. And then the third webinar series, now we're actually developing our full course in Virtual Campus, adding things like banners, icons, colors, and maybe more interesting components that add that last aesthetic appeal to the course and actually have a live course to work in. And then just a couple more examples of what that might look like. So before we move on to the question period, just to let you know, if you do have general questions for us or you want to make book a meeting with one of our educational consultants, you can contact us at SAEA-TLSS@uottawa.ca. And our administrators there will link you with a educational specialist. And then if you have particular questions about this PowerPoint, then that's my email as well that you can contact me. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar and we'll open it up to questions in a moment.